My name's Tom Carrico. Welcome to the beginning of our two-day conference called Free Speech Civil Discourse. I think we're going to have a lot of conversations. I'm not going to have a lengthy beginning right now. We've come back for the keynote this evening with Jeff Rosen. We'll have sort of a bit more throat clearing about what's going on. We're going to go straight into things with our first panel. And I'm going to turn it over to Nancy Powers, Assistant Professor of Political Science and Assistant Director of the Center for the Study of American Democracy. So thank you all for coming, and over to you, Nancy.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you. So thank you all for coming. The way we're going to do this is you have the just snippets of the illustrious CVs of each of these people in your program, so we are going to dispense with the formalities. And going to ask each of our panelists, starting with Eugene Volokh from UCLA, followed by Teresa Began from Oxford University, followed by Shadi Hamid from Brookings Institution. We'll ask each of them to give about a 3-minute presentation or so, then I'll ask some questions, have some discussion, and we'll open it up to questions from the audience after that. So.
Sure. So I was told I'm a lawyer and talk about the law. I'm going to tell you about the law. Happy to talk later about what the law ought to be, but this is the law as it is. The First Amendment protects speech against government restriction, regardless of the viewpoint that the speech expresses. There is no hate speech exception to the First Amendment. That means the court hasn't had occasion to have to define what hate speech is because it is not a legally significant label. To be sure, there are some exceptions to this protection. For example, true threats of criminal conduct, whether racist or sexist or anti-religious or whatever else, or completely unrelated to any of those categories, are unprotected, but not because they're supposedly hateful, not because they express certain views, but because they are threats of criminal conduct. Likewise, there's a very narrow exception for incitement of imminent unlawful conduct that is likely to and intended to produce such conduct. Classic example is standing in front of a building orating to a mob about how you should burn it down. Again, it doesn't matter whether it's based on whether it's pro-equality or anti-equality or whatever else. That exception exists. There's no hate speech exception. There are some narrow exceptions that might incidentally sweep in a small fraction of what some people label hate speech. So that has to do with the government punishing speech. Now, there's also a zone where the government subsidizes or promotes speech. So, for example, when the government says to student groups at a public university, here is a classroom, you can book it if you'd like for your own speakers. Once it does that, once it creates a so-called limited public forum for the expression of the students' own views, not its views, but the students' own views and the views of their invited speakers, it cannot then discriminate based on viewpoint. It's true even if it gives students money to invite speakers. It can't attach viewpoint-based restrictions, e.g. no anti-gay speakers or no pro-gay speakers, let's say, or something along those lines. One thing to keep in mind is this applies to the government. The first word of the First Amendment is, anyone want to volunteer? Congress. People who know. It's not speech, it's Congress. It's the Congress shall make no law. That's been applied to other branches of the federal government through the 14th Amendment to states, and therefore to state universities and community colleges and such. Private universities are not bound by the First Amendment. In California, they're bound by a statute that imposes First Amendment-like rules, and many private universities have said that they're voluntarily going to comply with First Amendment type rules either. And as many words or something like that. And often people try to hold universities' feet to the fire there if they on one hand are saying, oh yes, we support free speech, and then on the other hand restrict some speakers, but it's not a First Amendment issue. So that's the very big picture. I'm happy to talk later about the smaller quarters of the picture.
Okay, thank you very much. So if nearly anything can be said legally under the U.S. Constitution, maybe everything shouldn't be said. And I think that leads us into a little bit of Teresa's relevance.
Yeah, so thank you for having me. I mean, I think my purpose on this panel, and as in a book that I recently published, which is called Mere Civility, which is for sale outside, my purpose is really to plead for the importance of history, and specifically of intellectual history and the history of political thought, in approaching and navigating some of these contemporary controversies that we're facing about civility and civil discourse on the one hand and free speech on the other. But I guess I should perhaps say prehistory, because from the perspective of the Constitution and the First Amendment, the kind of history I'm talking about seems positively ancient. And so my history is the debates about religious toleration in the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe and also in the colonies of North America. So I think that one of the things I argue in my book is that I think that our general ignorance of that history actually has contributed a lot to some of the familiar frustrations that we encounter when we debate things like free speech and civility today, and why particularly it feels like so often we're talking past each other, precisely when we think we're talking about the things that matter to us most deeply. I think that the truth is that we operate with a lot of misimpressions about how we got here, how concepts like civility and how concepts like free speech that seem obvious, familiar, and ours really developed, what they actually mean. And also the history, a misimpression of the history of how we, contemporary citizens of a liberal democracy like the United States of America, came to inhabit that regime and its peculiar constellation of individual rights, of speech, freedoms of exercise, worship, religious worship, association, and of speech and expression. So why do we think those three things go together? Why should we think that? So anyway, but what I want to focus just for now is to say, I think that this false sense of that history has contributed to the sense that many of us have that the problems that we're currently facing to do with things like hate speech are unprecedented. And in particular, that liberalism and liberal democracy, with that set of individual rights, lacks the intellectual and institutional resources needed to cope with problems like hate speech and other forms of incivility. And as I argue in my book, and as I'll say right here, I just think that's dead wrong. It's absolutely wrong. But I just want to make 3 points here for you now. I mean, the first point is that hate speech, what we call hate speech, is not a new problem. It's certainly as old as liberal democracy itself. It's actually quite a bit older. And one of the things I argue in my book is to say that the origins of what we think of as liberalism were in precisely debates about uncivil speech like hate speech and how to handle it, how it should be addressed, and whether or not it could be addressed through law. In the fights about religious toleration that followed after the Protestant Reformation 500 years ago this year, concerns about verbal violence, oftentimes we think, verbal violence is some kind of barbarous new coinage, right? No. Concerns about verbal violence, in addition to physical violence caused by religion, were front and center. Remember, before there was the internet, there was this thing called the printing press, and it too was really great at spreading anonymous and really obscene language about those you disagreed with. Phenomenal for that. That's how Luther got his start, okay? So in those debates, when people talked about and complained about persecution, they weren't simply complaining about persecution of sword and stake, of the flame, right? They were complaining about what they called persecution of the tongue, right? And trying to figure out ways to deal with this, because the thought was people who are divided by religion cannot coexist peacefully if they are free to call each other the names, the literally denominations that come to hand, right? John Locke complains that we cloak each other with animal skins like the Romans did the primitive Christians, all the better to bait vicious animals, right? We dehumanize each other so that we can then harm each other in more physical ways, reform each other out of existence, right? And so it was all people on all sides of these debates, whether or not you were against toleration or for it, could agree that persecution of the tongue was one of the biggest threats to your society. And because of that, religious insult statutes that look a hell of a lot like modern hate speech laws were enacted throughout Europe, and this is crucial, not just in officially intolerant countries that did not permit religious diversity. Religious insult statutes were particularly popular in the colonies in North America dedicated to the idea of religious toleration. So my favorite here comes from Maryland. There's another one in Quaker, Pennsylvania. Everyone could agree, whether you were for toleration or against it, that a tolerant society that permitted religious difference would also have to be a civil one. You would have to regulate civility and ban uncivil speech about religion, right? So given this, given this history, I think it's really important for all of us here, especially of those of us who might want to defend the American way, this kind of peculiarly permissive approach to uncivil speech and hate speech today. It's important for us to reckon with that history. How did this kind of civilitarian consensus get broken? Because free speech as a principle was not obvious to anyone on any side of that issue. And so in the book, what I argue is, if you're really concerned to defend this, you're going to have to take seriously that the people who challenged that civilitarian consensus weren't sort of secular philosophers like Spinoza or John Locke, you know, the kind of people that you encountered in philosophy class. It was barn-burning evangelical Christians, men like Roger Williams of Rhode Island, who defended evangelical liberty on the basis that the sword of the tongue, the sword of the spirit, had to be free to battle heresy wherever it could be found, right? So the idea that free speech in a kind of unrestrained way is essential to a tolerant society can be traced, I submit, to those arguments. And so the question becomes, for those of us who might want to defend free speech today, how do we defend free speech in such a way that we're not insisting that words are harmless, that they don't matter, mere words, right? Like John Stuart Mill might say, you know, oh, it's just speech, or Kant, who says that, you know, freedom of speech is harmless. We know speech isn't harmless. We know that words wound. So if you want to defend speech while acknowledging the power of words to wound, I think that this history is really important for us today.
Thank you so much. Shadi, you want to jump in?
Yes. So something new has happened. For the first time, we as Americans elected an illiberal Democrat as our head of state. And I'm talking here about liberalism and illiberalism in the classical sense, the classical liberal tradition. And, you know, we no longer agree, or perhaps we no longer pretend to agree on an American idea, the American idea. And for me, this is very striking because if we had been talking 5-6 years ago, when I used to speak to American audiences about the Middle East, I would draw this contrast that in the Middle East, debates and divides are about foundational issues. They are who are we questions, who are we question mark. And I used to say, well, in America, we debate policy. We don't really anymore. And I don't know anyone, including myself, I voted for Hillary, I'll be open about that. I don't know anyone personally who voted for Hillary really for policy reasons. We voted for Hillary because we decided that we were part of a tribe. Now, it's a tribe that we believe in for specific reasons, but it was fundamentally a question of identity. So this is new for me in terms of my own country. It's not new for me in terms of the work and research that I've done in the Middle East, where questions around the role of religion and identity were always front and center. So this is a challenging thing to deal with. And another way of putting it, I suppose, is that I think for the first time, politics is something in America, at least in my lifetime. I can't speak for older folks maybe, but in my lifetime, this is the first time where I think it's reasonable to cry about politics in my own country. But I was used to, of course, seeing people cry about politics and die about politics in the countries that I was doing field work in. So, what does this all mean? What do we do about this? What does this mean? What are the implications? So, I think from the perspective of the left, and as someone who still considers myself to be of the left, even though I have big disagreements, the problem seems to be that there are a lot of illiberal people in America. And by this I mean illiberal people, many of whom voted for President Trump, who are either, as the argument would go, racist, don't believe in gender equality, hate Muslims, and as a Muslim myself, that kind of bothers me a bit, I guess. Who have an ambivalent relationship with constitutional liberalism in the sense that they may know about the Constitution, but could you register Muslims in a database if it came to that for security reasons? Perhaps. So those, and I think from the perspective of the left, what you often hear is this idea that it's inconceivable that there was a legitimate reason to vote for Donald Trump. But I think that doesn't make much sense, because if 63 million people voted for someone, presumably they, in their own minds, had legitimate reasons for voting for him, even if we as center-left or left people find that to be quite disagreeable, or, to put it another way, deplorable. So I'm very much a believer, so I'm sort of like a democratic purist in the sense that I believe one of the most important rights in a liberal democracy is for people to have the right to be illiberal, for people to not be liberal, to people to disassociate themselves from the liberal consensus. That's a very basic thing about freedom. And if parties or movements come to power through democratic means and they pursue illiberal objectives, if we claim to be a democracy, then we have to have some respect for those outcomes. As long as the people who are expressing this illiberalism do so within the confines of the law and the Constitution, whatever country they happen to be in. So for us, that's obviously our laws and our Constitution. To me, that should be the only relevant bar. Of course, then there are interpretive questions about what does the law or what does the Constitution say. But let's take, for example, Christian evangelicals or Orthodox Jews or conservative Muslims or Islamists who believe that religion should play a central role in public life, and they want to limit the rights of others for religious reasons. So, for example, that would be relevant to gay rights or transgender rights, but also a lot of other issues, the right to have a legal abortion and so on. Those people should not be cast out of the American family. And for me, that's the only thing that we can ultimately share when push comes to shove. Again, as long as they're not resorting to violence or doing anything that would be considered illegal. Now, this idea that I'm proposing to you about this sort of democratic purism, it's difficult, I think, for leftists or progressives to really be comfortable with that, because it goes against the very teleology of progressivism. That's why they're called, I guess we're called progressives, is because we believe that history has a progressive trajectory, that it proceeds along a certain line, and then there are things that we're supposed to leave behind us in the past. So if people don't want to bake a cake or make a cake for a gay couple that's getting married, we believe that should be relegated to the dustbin of history. So it's hard for us to sort of absorb that there are still people who might very passionately and strongly believe in those things, and so on. So this leads me to the final point I'll make, and I think to have a different perspective on accepting illiberalism, you have to sort of rethink the aims of democracy in the first place. And I think oftentimes, and this is something you hear a lot from center-left managerial technocrats, like people like Obama and Hillary Clinton, and a lot of the Democratic Party, is that the point of democracy is that it's supposed to produce better outcomes. It's supposed to deliver results. It's supposed to improve people's standard of living. I think we have to do away with that conception of democracy, because it no longer works in a society that's as divided as we are on foundational questions. Democracy, in my view, or I would posit to you that democracy should fundamentally be about managing deep difference and deep ideological divides peacefully. And that might sound like a low, modest bar, but I think it's actually not so modest in the broader sweep of history. It's not necessarily so easy to live up to that. So that also means, I think, giving up this idea that democracy should produce consensus. I think consensus, there's a fetish around it. I don't think there should be consensus. Because if we disagree on fundamentals, presumably we disagree on them for reasons that are important to us, whether it's for religious reasons or ideological reasons. The only way to produce consensus is to tell people that their deeply held views are no longer legitimate, and that they have to join our consensus the very notion of consensus is actually by definition exclusionary, because if people end up joining some artificial consensus, it means that there are other people who will be left behind and who will be considered outside of that consensus. And I think that's dangerous ultimately for democracy.
You've thrown a lot at us. So, you talked about the purism of democracy. As someone who studied Latin America, there's a concurrence in that literature from those who experienced the purists of democracy in the 1960s and 70s, who wanted a social democracy, and democracy is all good things for all good people. And ultimately, by the 80s and 90s, the scholars from Latin America said, no, democracy is about a competition for power, and we're all much safer if we just leave it at that basic level. So both of you talked about a certain purism. I know, Teresa, you're talking in your book about the politics of purity. And I think, as you say, there are clear parallels between our time and the time you studied in the 16th and 17th century. At the time, the purists were the Puritans, the religious purists who saw heresy and blasphemy in others. Shadi certainly written about the issue of folks who see blasphemy and don't want to tolerate it. And today we have folks who feel like racism or misogyny or religious belief or other ideas are just beyond the pale and dangerous in some way. So talk more about what we do with that and about the politics of purity and how Roger Williams does that.
How Roger Williams can save us.
Yeah, our mere
that's in the book.
Our mere civility can save us.
Yeah, I use that phrase in the book, the politics of purity, and since the book has come out, I think that's one of the things that struck me most, just the politics of purity is really back. And I'm struck by how many of the debates that we think of as free speech debates may not actually be free speech debates at all. What they are is about, what are the fundamenta, what are the fundamental dogmas of our religion? What must you profess to believe in order to be considered a member in good standing of our society, which is a good society? And that, if you recognize the debates in that way, there's not just a kind of similarity. I mean, I think functionally, it's exactly the same kind of debates about, what does it take to be a member of the Boston Church, for this, in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. This idea, what must you believe, what must you profess in order to be a member of this society that I can trust, right? And it was precisely, one of the reasons I find Roger Williams so great is because he was a dissenter, and of course, Shadi, the opposite of consensus is dissensus, and the opposite of consent is dissent. Williams dissented from that and said, you can dissent from the dogma and the fundamenta of the church and nevertheless remain a good man and a good citizen, right? This is the whole idea of disestablishment. You don't need to believe certain doctrines in order to be a good person, a good citizen. You believe in to be a good person, but not to be a good citizen. And that kind of basic insight, I think we really are in need. I just been pointing that at, that I don't, it would be really nice if we agreed on all of the fundamental truths. But that's not what's required for coexistence. And coexistence, again, as Shadi said, coexistence is pretty hard, but pretty precious. Right? So let's not make our sort of high expectations, our hopes for purity, the enemy of the goodness of coexisting here and now.
And as I understand it, the coexistence, though, was not a value relativism. Rogers was going to tell everybody they were heretical and wrong, but he was going to allow them to be so.
Absolutely. So the other part of the story is that can't we all just agree to disagree about religion? That wasn't really Williams's position. He was like, no, let's agree to disagree constantly, loudly, and verbally, violently about religion. It was this kind of evangelical democracy that what we want is everyone to agree to be a member of this society, and then agree to fight their spiritual battles with tongues, not with swords.
So, if you follow my train of thought and agree with me that all Americans don't necessarily need to sign on to classical liberalism, but they do have to hold democracy, small d democracy, perhaps in the more procedural, minimalist sense, sacrosanct, then that ultimately leads to very interesting tensions. Now, let's say theoretically that it wouldn't happen here. You couldn't really easily pass a blasphemy law in the US because it would violate the Constitution and it would be struck down, even if you had a majority in Congress that wanted that, hypothetically, if there was some sort of Handmaid's Tale democratic scenario. That said, I think we also have to remember that our constitutional principles are not irrevocable, that they can be undone if you have 2/3 of both houses of Congress and 75% of the state. So theoretically, if you had a supermajority of Americans as represented through their elected Congress people, they could, I guess theoretically, come up with some amendment that would block Muslims from holding office somehow. I guess, right? But you would need a lot of Americans to believe that, and that's very unlikely. But it's worth noting that unlike some other constitutions, our constitutional articles are actually changeable, right? So I think that theoretically, in other countries that don't have as strong of a Bill of Rights, they could pass blasphemy laws as long as whatever Supreme Court there, if they would say, hey, okay, this actually falls within the acceptable legal bounds. And I think that is the tension that really happens in every democracy. I guess here, the most obvious example would be restricting abortion rights, which would be restricting in some sense how women express themselves or how women understand their own bodies. That's a pretty fundamental thing, right? But if a majority in a legislature in a certain country wants to do that, they can restrict at least some aspects of abortion access. So I guess the question then would be, how comfortable are we with that idea of democratic majorities if enough people believe in these things, if enough people believe in illiberal precepts to actually pass those things through a democratic process, again within the confines of whatever constitution there is, and if the Constitution blocks it, they could theoretically get a supermajority to change the Constitution. And that I think is going to be a difficult issue going forward in the next, I don't know, 100 to 500 years. I mean, if I want to just like play out where we're going, where I think there's a very strong resurgence of illiberalism, not just in the Middle East or in India or Israel or the Philippines, but also in the heart of the West. And I would posit that the sort of 1990s, 2000s end of history sort of situation was really the aberration in the broader sweep of history. So I think we all have to be prepared to deal with this tension and to accept democratic outcomes that we might find as small L liberals threatening to our own personal sense of freedom. But if we are committed small d Democrats, we're going to have to come to terms with some of that at least.
So I wanted to speak to a little bit of what you said there and then tie it into a slightly different point about that's especially important to the academy, although I think not limited to that. One is we have to realize that when we're talking about illiberalism, unless what we're talking about is failure to conform with a particular agenda or a particular political group in the country today, that kind of liberalism, which I take it is you're not talking about, we have to recognize that there's a lot of understandable uncertainty, dispute about what that means. Abortion is a classic example. There are those who believe that abortion is murder. It's not personally my view, but they think we're perfectly liberal. In fact, it's the pro-abortion forces, the pro-abortion rights forces, but that inevitably means pro-abortion as well. They would say are the ones who are shockingly illiberal. I mean, how can you be calling yourself liberal when you're engaging in genocide? What's more, there was actually just recently a decision in state, I forget which state, but somewhere not far from here, which struck down a state law that banned discriminatory abortions. The law provided that you can't perform an abortion based on the sex of a child or the race of a child or disability. The latter, by the way, as I said, is extraordinarily common. And again, personally, I don't find anything immoral about it as such. But lots of people do, and it's not like this is a ridiculous position to take. So part of the problem is the whole dispute about what should be viewed as the liberal position among others, among people who might actually have a lot of other things they agree on, but it's a different judgment. An echo of that, by the way, happens in animal rights disputes, right? Whether you believe what is the liberal position depends on who you think is entitled to liberty, entitled to rights. But this brings into a broader question, which is how do we decide what is right and how do we decide what is true as a factual matter? And part of what troubles me about some recent movements, and by the way, they're recent in our vision, but they're certainly centuries, if not millennia old, perhaps they're inherent aspect of human nature, is that there are certain things that people are trying to just categorically write out of the analysis. So you mentioned misogyny. Misogyny means a lot of different things, but let me give you a specific example of something that I think is actually a very interesting empirical question. So there are two interesting facts about demographics of various institutions in the U.S. So there are many interesting facts. Here are two. One is that prisons are overwhelmingly populated by male inmates, by a vast, vast margin. Another is that executive boardrooms are overwhelmingly populated by male executives, by very, very substantial margins. Now, there are several possible explanations for each of these, and they may be completely different for each. One might be discrimination. And by the way, it could apply to the former as well. It could be that prosecutors are more likely to throw the book at male defendants than at female. Maybe not. Another is culture. Men are acculturated into being more violent, and women into being less violent. Men are acculturated into being more ambitious, and women are kind of persuaded that no, they should go off on the money track. That's possible. A third might be innate. It may be that men and women, we do have one of our chromosomes that we don't share. I guess one chromosome, one half of a chromosome pair. There are hormonal differences. It's possible that men are more violent because their testosterone, to use I think an oversimplified formulation, might lead us, at least some of us, not all of us, not me, I'm okay, to be especially violent. And it may be that it leads people men to be especially ambitious, and thus more likely to invest effort into that kind of thing. Now, I have no idea what's the right answer. Certainly not as a scholar. I haven't studied this. Life is short. I have other fields to study. But I do think that isn't, first of all, I think we can agree that is not a question one can resolve just by fiat about what is the liberal answer. It is an empirical question about the world. And I think one thing we should agree on is, as scholars, as people who appreciate science, this is a question that we cannot let our preconceptions in either direction blind us to the answer. A second point is that even if you are quite confident, based on research, say, that you've read, in one answer, the answer might be all of the difference in, let's say, your CEO representation is based on discrimination and culture. None of it is based on biology. For all I know, that could be exactly the right answer. But even if you are confident, because you read the research that points in that direction, you can only be confident so long as you know that research that points the opposite direction can be done. It's just like if you're in a jury, and if you hear from the prosecution, you hear from the defense, you say guilty, totally guilty. But let's say you're in a jury, you hear from the prosecution, and the judge says, I'm sorry, you're not going to hear from the defense because it's illegal for the defense to speak up. Not only is that unfair to the defendant, you as a member of the jury can no longer say, well, I think the defendant is guilty beyond reasonable doubt, because you haven't heard his attempt to try to demolish the case. So in fact, if you do believe in a position that you view as more liberal, and this empirical question, then it seems to me you can only believe in it honestly, as opposed to believe in it because you like to believe in it, if you are aware that there is, or if you know that people are free to rebut this. And then you could say, I'm willing to defer to conventional wisdom of scholars about this.
Can I
Yes.
challenge you on this, though? I mean, I'm skeptical that those kinds of questions can be empirically resolved, because I ultimately see them as matters of faith. If you want to believe in, I mean, it is so central to the left tribe in America to believe in certain things about innate dispositions of whether it has to do with gender or other issues, that I don't know if even if I really wanted to be as empirical as I could be, then I could actually look at these results objectively, because I am wedded to a particular outcome. And this idea that there's any access to on things that are that really deal with foundational questions about who we are, I just don't see any evidence really almost anywhere that we can actually resolve these questions in a way that is unbiased or objective. Does that?
Well, it doesn't have to be completely unbiased and objective. None of us are going to be completely unbiased and objective, because before anything else, we're monkeys. We're human beings with urges and impulses and emotions. There's no doubt about that. But I would think that the whole function of this institution, as well as other educational institutions, is to try to lead us to be able to think about these things as objectively as is possible given our constraints.
So can I probably, because this, I mean, it seems to me that part of what's at stake in this disagreement here is, again, I'm going to apply my 17th century lens to suddenly make everything clear to you. Is we're fighting about how broad a church liberalism should be. Right? And because we're fighting about how broad the liberal church should be, no wonder that a lot of our ire, a lot of our concern is going to focus on the universities as the educational and credentialing institutions that produce the liberals of tomorrow. So this question about, well, surely to be a liberal means to pursue truth where it leads, to pursue free inquiry, to believe in science, because science, after all, is the engine of progress, right? Liberals are the fact-based community. We've always heard that. And then on the other hand, the realization that actually what it means to be a liberal is also to say certain questions really shouldn't be asked. You know, as a woman, right, do I constantly want to be debating whether or not women are differentially abled when it comes to science? I think probably when it comes to, you know, large-scale aggregate patterns, that there are differences between men and women. Do I think that I constantly want to be debating this? Is that really going to help me get my work done? No. Right?
But why do you have to constantly debate it? You know, I don't constantly debate every issue. You can say it's not my field, but if there is a scientific inquiry, then scientists should be talking about it.
Scientists should be talking about it. What I want to challenge is the kind of conflation of the scientific community with the liberal community. Right? This idea, and I have to say, you know, I'm with you with wanting to surrender progressive as a label. I think it just causes way more trouble than it's worth here. To say that, you know, but this is why, you know, the place that universities occupy in our own society is quite like the place they occupied in 17th century England, which was the credentialing body for ministers of the Church of England. Of course the curriculum really matters. Of course it really matters what you believe when you leave. Because you're then going to go rule the society of which you will be part. Right? And so I just want to point to that. I mean, are there ways of lowering the stakes by decoupling these things, by not conflating? You know, I'm a splitter, not a lumper, and I think that one of the great things about early modern political thought is this realization we can split things instead of lumping them.
But what do you mean by splitting and lumping?
So making distinctions rather than pushing things together.
Okay.
Right?
I think we should split when we ought to split and lump.
I'm not sure I can quite find the magic arrow in this debate, but I wanted to throw out to the audience another aspect of your work and give you a chance to say something about it. Teresa, you've talked about...
I'm sorry. Don't ask that question.
You mentioned that there's an ancient Greek tradition. We'll just turn this off. I don't need a microphone for my class. I don't need one here. So there are two different ways of thinking about freedom of speech, at least. One of which has to do with, I'm not going to try to pronounce the Greek, so one of which has to do with the freedom to speak in the sense that you're allowed in the room to talk. You're allowed to participate in the forum. Sort of focus on participation. And the other is you're allowed to say every darn thing you please however you want. And you talked about Europeans and Americans, democracies, having different sort of emphases here. And I wondered if I could bring in the other of you two, Eugene, especially in constitutional law. Is there a tendency in the American case to focus more on the say whatever you darn please versus making sure people have access to be part of the conversation? Which also leads to your writing about the modern technology and new media and all of that.
Shall I just say a bit about the distinction that Nancy was referring to? So, one of the things that it seems is really striking about debates about free speech is that people mean very different things by free speech, and I think this is a very ancient confusion. So, in ancient Greece, there was a distinction right between isagoria, which is a sort of equal right to enter the forum, to participate in the assembly, right? So the agora, the place of assembly. And then another thing, parasia, which is a kind of free and frank speech, right? Speak truth to power, often in an offensive way, right? And I think that this division between isagoria and parasia, when we talk about free speech, you could just trace it all the way through the tradition. In the Enlightenment, a lot of people, someone like Kant, for example, is definitely talking about isagoria. What he's talking about is the freedom to exchange reasons in debate, right? What my 17th century evangelicals are talking about is parasia, right? The freedom to speak as the Spirit moves, the freedom to use the sword of the Spirit. And I think, just very crudely speaking, that American free speech, the tradition, is a parasiastic tradition. Whereas in European liberal democracies, they're talking about isagoria. And a lot of the times when we're talking past each other, it's just because we have these very different understandings of what it is we mean by free speech. And so I think getting clear on that conceptual distinction can actually just help a lot, so we can understand what we're disagreeing about. And so the question then is there a place for isagoria as this kind of equal right to participate in debate? Is that underappreciated in the American tradition?
Well, I mean, is this really, this isn't necessarily a legal question as much as it is sort of a sort of societal pressure issue. I mean, I feel like the bigger issue that I face living in a place where most people are Democrats and on the left side is just the chilling effects of not being seen as outside the bounds of having problematic views. And if our colleagues and peers see us saying things, even in a private setting when we're getting together socially, that can be a very powerful factor. And I'll just be honest here, I can get away with a lot for a very simple reason. And maybe this comes to the issue of positionality, which I guess is a word that's used more on college campuses. Honestly, because I'm sort of on the totem pole of disadvantaged minorities, I'm pretty high. In the era of Trump, the fact that I'm Muslim gives me a certain ability to say things that perhaps other people couldn't say. So when I want to say something nice about white males, people will give me a pass. They'll be a little bit suspicious, and I'm going to be sort of like, what's it called, when you're the penalty box maybe for a little bit. But I've noticed this dynamic in social settings where I'll say something kind of like part provocatively, but also part seriously about, white males or something. And then the one white male in the group, because they're not as common in Washington, D.C. and my circle of friends, that they're like, oh, they feel more empowered to say it, but they're still a little bit reticent. And I think that, I think it is actually a serious issue of what people are comfortable saying. I see it on Twitter a lot too, that if you say certain things challenging the consensus on let's say, race or gender equality or whatever it might be, then then people attack you for a long time on Twitter. You get a lot of mentions in your Twitter feed, and that does have a chilling effect. And even myself, there are things that I have to be like, Shadi, like, is it worth it to actually talk about this publicly? Do the benefits outweigh the costs? For me, that's the bigger issue right now in the kind of circles that I happen to be in. I don't know what.
So are there, as you said, this isn't just legal, but there is as you mentioned, the ability in the private space for people to have their free speech taken away, right? You recently wrote an article about a Tampa University professor who got fired for a tweet that was on his private tweet. And I think Americans, we read a lot about people, the guy from Google who made comments somewhat like you did about, well, maybe there's some biology to differences in who's in the tech world, and he was fired because that's
good to have tenure.
The habits of censoring yourself that you develop in pursuit of tenure.
Yeah.
You know, by the time you get it, do you have a soul capable of I'm in the UK, so I have to worry about this stuff.
I try to be very foolish in my pursuit of tenure. But I'm sorry, so your question is about private constraints on speech.
No, but I just think the average person in America does not make the distinction that in the First Amendment allows me to say what I please, but I could get fired in a private institution, but rather feels a general sense of a need to self-center, of political correctness, of people not being quite
so there's a lot going on there. And so first, it turns out that about half the states have state statutes that actually limit employers' ability to fire people based on their speech. California is one of them. New York is another. They're written in different ways. Some of them apply to off-the-job speech, or may apply to only off-the-job speech. Some of them may apply to both on-the-job and off-the-job speech. Some of them have an exception for when the employer shows the speech is really disruptive of morale or really alienates customers or something like that. Others do not. Interestingly, they are little known. When I wrote up an article on them, I think I was the first to cite maybe a good half a dozen of those, although some others are known a little more, rarely litigated, whether it's because employees are rarely fired for such things, or because employment lawyers don't know about them, or because the remedies aren't enough to warn an employer of taking it on in contingency. I don't know. But it turns out there are some protections for private employees. One interesting question that arises is what the scope of those protections should be. Because many an employer says, look, you know, this employee is saying these things, and it's not like we just don't like his ideas and want to censor them, but we're afraid it's going to alienate customers. This is a big thing happening now with regard to the NFL protests. So those are interesting and difficult questions. It's true that American First Amendment law has not really dealt with them because it is quite clear that the First Amendment applies only to the government. But state law has sometimes had to deal with them, as have kind of social norms. That I take it that if we heard that an employer was firing employees simply because they had advocated for Hillary Clinton or for Donald Trump, even in a state that lacks that, we'd say that's really intolerant. Well, what if they were expressing racist views? What were they expressing unpatriotic views? Or what if they were expressing pro-communist views? What if they were wearing Che Guevara t-shirts? Does it matter if the employer's parents were chased out of Cuba during the revolution, or maybe killed by Che Guevara and his cohort? Che Guevara has lots of murders to his name. Those are interesting questions that, in part because they're not legal questions in many cases, or even if states that have these legal rules have never come to court, are ones that we don't have like a really, really firm answer to. Returning to your first question, though, which also has to do with private constraint, what about right of access? And it turns so there are two. There I can tell you with some confidence. So in 1974, the Supreme Court decided Miami Herald versus Ternillo. Florida had a statute that said if a candidate for office, it could be an incumbent, could be a challenger, is being criticized in a newspaper, you ought to have the right to respond. Seems like a plausible position. Supreme Court unanimously struck that down, saying that violates the newspaper's right to control what it publishes. And it also puts something of a tax on criticism. Because you know, if you just put reports of the latest Hollywood scandal, you're fine. But if you criticize a candidate, then you know you're going to have to give up some of your space, which is money to you, in order to publish his response. 1969, Red Lion versus FCC. The question was whether the fairness doctrine and the so-called personal attack rule was very close to the Miami Herald rule, although it applied to anybody and not just a candidate for office. Or the fairness doctrine, which required radio and television stations, to provide access to competing viewpoints, whether they were constitutional. The Supreme Court unanimously upheld that. And in Tornillo, it didn't try to reverse redline. So we've had this doctrine where there is no public right of access to newspapers and book publishers and to magazines, even back in the day when newspapers were really important. And there would often be one or two newspapers in any particular town. Whereas for broadcasters on the ground, the spectrum is scarce, even though back when I was growing up in LA, we had one basically newspaper, the LA Times, and we had a good dozen prominent television stations. Because the spectrum is scarce, the government can regulate it. The real reason, I think, was tradition, that radio and television had been traditionally regulated. But we had this experience with the Fairness Doctrine. My sense is that Fairness Doctrine was repealed by the FCC in the mid-'80s. It's not coming back, I think. If it did come back, I think it would be struck down now. Because I think part of the problem is if you're going to provide right of access, then you're going to have to ask how much access and to whom. I mean, really, imagine some television program is about how horrible Jim Crow was. And somebody says, well, I want to have a rival view. I think Jim Crow was a wonderful idea. Obviously, lots of people thought so back then. Some people still think so now. I should do that. Now, maybe if you really are, and maybe if you really are a believer in free speech, in the sense of freedom to actually have access to private broadcasters and not just freedom not to be punished for it, maybe you would want it, but then somebody else says, well, I have a subtly different view. Because after all, there are rarely two viewpoints in any issues. Or somebody else says, I have a view. It's for, let's say, some reasonable position. But it turns out they're a stooge for the other side, and they present the most ridiculous possible view. Trust me, if we were to do that, somebody would do it. So it turns out that between administrability concerns and the concerns that maybe that would lead to much free speech in some respects, I think Fairness Doctrine has gone in bad odor. So that's where I think you're right, that American law has focused on freedom from government punishment and not right of access to private.
I do want to just allow a couple questions from the audience, if that's okay. Can you answer really quickly?
Right, I was just to say that I think that that's absolutely right, but I think that the kind of claim of Isagoria today is more about social status. To say, when we say free speech, we want everyone to have an equal right, so everyone to have, their voice to be counted equally. So, Shadi, your observations about, the sort of the hierarchy of we have hierarchies of social privilege, right? But then we have hierarchies of social disadvantage, right? And so if you can sort of average out, right, then you have an equal status from which to say some kind of heretical thing.
Can I probably, I certainly see that there should be equal status based on race and sex and such, but I can't imagine there would be really equal status. Like, I don't want me to puff myself up, but I would like to think that I have slightly more status to talk about First Amendment law than some of the commenters that I've seen online who just happen not to know anything about it. I mean, I don't want to claim that I know a vast amount about it, but unless the taxpayers of California have been duped for decades, I know a bit about it. So how would the equal status play out, given that, in fact, there are differences in knowledge, differences in credibility in various reasons?
I think maybe not many, but I think certainly some of our colleagues in the academy have a little discomfort with that, the idea that they should somehow be considered to be higher or sort of, more authoritative on the basis of their degree. In early modern England, the degree that you received at university was literally a gentleman's degree because it raised you to the status of gentleman. Right, so it was actually the creation of social hierarchy. You ascended the ranks of society by virtue of your education, right? So this idea, and you get into this stuff in kind of standpoint epistemology, which says, by virtue of my identity and experiences as X, as a woman, as a member of X group, I can speak authoritatively about that in a way that you, by virtue of your membership and in that other cannot, right? So you get this kind of tension between people saying, oh, well, everyone should be, we achieve equality of status by saying, oh, well, all I care about is the strength and soundness of your argument, versus saying, oh, well, you achieve equality of status by recognizing, by everyone recognizing everyone else's authority in the areas, and I think the latter is really unstable. I think the former has something for it, but I think we're going to have to go back to actually making those arguments, rather than just assuming that it's obvious to everyone that equality is better achieved the former way.
Questions? 17 questions? Yes, Professor Graham.
The you were making to me, that we ought to try to rally on grounds of due process, in effect, right? Democratic, doesn't matter what the policy is, if they win, and we support the process. I think that's a great idea, but it seems to me that there's very little, less and less support for it, especially on the part, the group that you call liberal, namely the progressives, because progressivism has been hostile to due process arguments from the get-go. It's always been result-oriented, right? Wilson, Beard, and I think you find it in those managerial liberals like Obama and Hillary as well. The education of children hasn't been any more the education in the Constitution, but it's been in social history more than anything else. It's also been result-oriented. So I agree with you, that would be great to be able to rally on the grounds of pure democracy in the sense of due process. But it seems to me that limb has almost been sawn off and cracked on the left. And on the right, the people who talk about constitutional liberties, they don't seem to mean it either because they're too angry. So, where do you go?
I think there's a question down here as well. We'll just take 2 or 3 comments, questions, and then.
Actually, my question, I think, goes well with the question that has posed. During her answer to her own question, how broad a church should liberalism be, Teresa talked about lowering the stakes. What I want to say is that lowering the stakes is another name for liberalism. Liberalism, as I see it, is a brief against conviction. It's the idea that everyone should get to play, but no one should be allowed to win. And therefore, it seems to me that the opposition is between those who are willing to let things slide now and then, so that some kind of democratic deliberation with a small d can be achieved, and those who want to push through to the truth. Illiberals, as they've been named, don't want to adhere to the ground rules of democratic discourse, and indeed view those ground rules as an artifact of the ideology they oppose and fear. In short, all of this has been and always will be irresolvable.
I don't know if that's the last word. I want to give you all just a brief chance to respond or make a final wrap-up comment. Our time is about.
I actually, can we ask, I'm sorry to set us hierarchies, but can we have a question or two from the students? And then maybe we can answer them, and our colleagues will get the last word.
Okay.
Hi, so one big issue pertaining to like the realms of society in which people can, propagate like their crazy radical ideas outside of like the regular mainstream media. Like after the 1969 decision, there's social media platforms, YouTube. So there's a lot of people who have ascended pretty popularly and gotten really big followings, militant followings, in fact, pertaining to the radical ideologies. So I'm wondering how you can sort of fit this argument of net neutrality, which is coming up pretty soon, in the framework of this pure democracy. Whether you think that the internet should be a marketplace in which the companies themselves are allowed to limit the flow of ideas, or whether you should just leave it open.
So net neutrality refers to the ability of basically, in a sense, backbone carriers, I'm oversimplifying here, to privilege certain kinds of content over others. But almost always it has to do with not ideological privileging, but like, for example, we're going to privilege certain kind of streaming service over others because we're getting money from them. I think what you're getting at is the question of whether Google and YouTube, which is a branch of Google now, and Twitter and Facebook and other such intermediaries, to whether and to what extent they should be free to do what Miami Herald might do, which is to say, we don't want to carry this material because it's our property and we choose to not to provide it. And to what extent would we say, they're so important, have such market share and so many millions of viewers that we need to regulate their ability to regulate speech, just like we regulate the government's ability to do that. Let me flag, it's an interesting question, I don't have a clear answer, so I hope this would clarify this. Let me flag one question though. For some of them, and Google search is an excellent example, and I should disclose that I've been a lawyer for Google in the past and wrote a paper for them on this. But one of the things that we want from Google is precisely selectivity. Right? Google would be useless if it gave us all of the pages that reference something in random order. Right? We want accurate material. So if Google were to say, I don't think on grounds of extremism something to be excluded, but this material is spam, this material is fake news, whatever exactly it means, this is not therefore what we readers want, in a sense, that's kind of providing more valuable information to us as readers. So that's one of the things that makes kind of the model of, well, they should just be neutral arbiters, particularly difficult, because often what we want from them is, in fact, not from the ISPs necessarily, but from Google's and such, is not neutral.
So I'm just to say, Stanley, I think that you and I are both in favor of a broad church. We're sort of low church liberals, you might call it.
I'm not a liberal. But you may identify yourself as you please. In that sense, I'm liberal.
That's very as all sort of denominational labeling, I will then embrace the label thrust upon me as a sort of point of pride,
Right.
just like the Quakers.
Right.
But I think this point, it goes to the first questioner. The idea, can we solve this by saying, oh, all the consensus we need is procedural? Well, the problem then becomes in distinguishing what's a procedural matter from what's a matter of substance, and and then that's your point where it just is infinite. So yeah, I would say that the advantage of the kind of early modern sort of low church sort of minimalist position I'm capturing is that Roger Williams is an absolutist and a Puritan in religion, right? He's not going to compromise on that, but he thinks that this world, the world of the polis, of the Commonwealth, is a world of fallenness and sin. And we just got to rebel along together. I find that an attractive view. I think we can get a lot of mileage out of that. But in any case, but just to say on this point about net neutrality, I think that one of the things that's kind of been in the background of a lot of the discussion and that we need to think about more is something that, the distinction between legal versus political versus social tyranny when it comes to censorship when it comes to speech. And one of the things that's just shocking to me, and I put it to you students out there, when I teach Mills on liberty to my students at Oxford, they cannot grasp that Mill is making an argument against social enforcement and restriction of speech. Mill begins on liberty by saying, the political and legal issue is settled. I'm arguing against social enforcement. And we are now in a time where Twitter moms and everything else says that no, absolutely, what we want is a social enforcement, this chilling effect. Put that out here.
So on the first question, this problem of respecting democratic outcomes is a universal one, left, right, middle, religious, secular, whatever. Democracy is a lot better when you know you're going to win. It becomes more challenging when you lose, and I think that this is always going to be the test. I think, as you're suggesting, I've been quite troubled by some on the left's response to Trump's victory, but I think Trump winning is almost a sort of hard test or a really good test of our democratic commitments. If you take someone who seems the most unqualified, bad, terrible person that you could possibly imagine winning a presidential contest, that would be the test to see if we really believe in our principles. And it's unfortunate that just like a day after he won, before he even took office, people were talking about changing the rules with the Electoral College after the ballots had been cast. That's a very dangerous thing to propose. I think one way of addressing this is we have to sort of get back to this question of why do we believe in democracy in the first place? And I don't see a lot of discussion about this because maybe it goes, we all assume that we believe in democracy, so no one feels a need to really discuss why we believe in democracy, but I suspect that many people are results-oriented Democrats. They don't believe in democracy as the right to make the wrong choice. And I think that's an important conversation we have to have. And just one very quick thing on the second question is, if liberalism is about lowering the stakes, I would maybe take a little bit of issue with that. Liberalism can be seen as a belief system, as a kind of faith. Of course, liberals don't see it that way because they're liberal and they think they're neutral. And so liberals would say that liberalism is great because everyone can express their deeply held ideas and convictions under the liberal umbrella. Of course, if you talk to people who are not liberal, they would disagree and they would say that they can't fully express their deepest convictions under liberalism. And I was going to actually say that Stanley Fish writes about this. I guess you're Stanley Fish. So I'm right here in line with you.
I will ask Eugene Volokh to verify.
But I mean, I think that you've talked about in your work liberalism's inherent contradiction, that liberals in opposing illiberalism come to mirror their opposite. This is a really big problem, and I guess what you would say is that there isn't really a way to definitively resolve this, but I think we all have to question this idea that liberalism is neutral and that it doesn't have convictions of its own. And I'll just say also that, do we really want a public sphere where we lower conviction? Conviction is really important. It's the most personal, fundamental thing that we have. If we have to enter the public sphere by giving up some of our deepest convictions, then is that really democratic? Is that really true to what we want to be as a society?
That demand is made of religion all the time.
And I think it's problematic. Yeah.
Well, wow. This is a great kickoff. Thank you all. I hope you will look up these folks' writing because there's lots more good stuff where this came from. We have a reception now upstairs. You're all welcome. Perhaps students can get first dibs on saying hello to our distinguished guests. And then in Ross Hall tonight at 7:30, we have Jeffrey Rosen speaking with an introduction by President Sean Cater, and we welcome you all to come back for that.